The question that we're going to pose this afternoon is, how well do we actually know who our learners are? And one of the studies that really impressed me, because for once it was a study that actually asked the learners themselves. And we talked about student voice and so on, but we've got to more frequently ask the students themselves. And in this study, Joe found that the student interest is strong, but the programs are academically weak. The students want schools and teachers to fix it, but ask us. Fix it, but ask us. So there was a feeling that not all is well in their language learning for these students of Japanese and Italian in Melbourne. And they wanted it fixed. In other words, they wanted to stay with language learning, but they wanted some of their issues fixed. But ask us. In other words, don't make your unilateral decisions, which of course is so easy. And I always look at needs assessment in that regard. And we say, needs assessment in language learning. And has it occurred to you that somehow the students' needs under needs assessment always end up being expressed in curriculum terms? Well, students don't speak curriculumese. So what's happened in that process that, we suddenly describe students' needs in inverted commas and it ends up being in curriculum speak? So in other words, we kind of half listen in needs assessment, but we then put our own overlays onto it. Now, let's be careful again. I'm not saying that the student's voice is the sole voice, but what I am saying is that if we would want engaging education, languages education, we've got to ask the learners. We've got to know the learners. And so what Joe says in this quote, this is a call for improvement in terms of both the quality and rigour. The students decry the program, saying it's a bludge. But they do not mean by this that they enjoy the fact that the program demands little of them. The Q sought evidence is clear. The students are not saying, in the face of what they interpret to be poor provision, that the program should be terminated. Instead, they are demanding improvement. And our job in knowing our learners is to understand something about how this work that we're doing, this activity that we've organised, this experience that we've organised, how can that be meaningful to the learners themselves? How can it become memorable? That's the actual book, and this is the study that Joe Lobianco did with Renata Aliani, and what they actually propose in the study is that they're interested in communication, but they actually want to learn more. It's clear to me that this pitter-patter of buying train tickets and so on, they've had enough of that already. And they also want excursions, but then we know well that students always like excursions. And obviously in this domain, they see the value of overseas, and trips overseas would obviously be important. They also say, teach us the culture as well as the language. They're certainly saying less worksheets. It's boring. It's tedious. They don't want it. What they want instead is real life experiences. And I didn't know that at the time of this particular volume coming out,